I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 251, The Hangar. Everyone, shut up. If you don't want to keep moving, find a room to hide in and don't drag the rest of us down. Lieutenant Colonel Cross's angry shout echoed through the corridor, her authority as the base commander instantly silencing the sniffling female recon. Not good, the hatch won't open. Normally, the hatches within the base were controlled by the AI, but with the power cut, the AI had also shut down, rendering the doors inoperable. However, the base's design had accounted for power failures. Every hatch was equipped with a basic manual opening mechanism, known as the hand crank. Under the illumination of flashlights, a few burly wounded soldiers stepped forward. Despite their weakened condition, they were still stronger than the administrative personnel. Removing a panel on the door revealed an old-fashioned crank. The men each took hold of a section and began turning it with all their might. Slowly, the crank rotated, and the hatch gradually opened. The group hurried through, but the process was so slow that their progress was now falling behind the swarm's advance. By the time they had passed through 10 hatches, the swarm had breached 14. This couldn't continue. If they didn't find a solution, the swarm would catch up before they even reached the hangar. Turn left here, Cross suddenly ordered after passing through 2 more hatches. Commander, turning left will take us off course, Kaida urgently reminded her. He was determined to ensure Cross reached the hangar safely. There's a storage room 2 hatches down to the left. It contains 3 sets of exoskeleton armor. With those, we can open the doors much faster, Cross explained. Reassured that the destination hadn't changed, Kaida stopped objecting and moved to the front to clear the path. A short while later, with the exoskeleton suits in use, their pace significantly increased. What previously required several strong men now only took 2 suits to accomplish with ease. Though the exoskeletons were noisy, the group could no longer afford to prioritize stealth. It was clear that the swarm had already locked onto their position. Their earlier efforts to reduce noise had done little to throw off the bugs. With the power outage, personal terminals with battery packs were still functional, but the base's surveillance systems were down, leaving them unable to pinpoint the swarm's current location. In the dark corridors, tactical flashlight beams swept around, illuminating their path. Footsteps, breathing, and the occasional sob seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. Cross couldn't shake the feeling that the faint, scraping sound of insect limbs against steel walls was drawing closer. The noise, faint and intermittent, gnawed at her nerves. Unable to resist, she turned her flashlight toward the rear, but all she saw was the dark wall and the faint outline of a hatch closing in the distance. Her action, however, sparked panic among the group. More flashlights joined hers in probing the darkness behind them. Though they found nothing, the collective fear grew, as if an invisible predator was stalking them from the shadows. Cross, hold on. Reinforcements will arrive in 10 minutes, Major General Porter's voice crackled through her personal terminal. Although the base's power was out, the communication function of their personal devices remained operational. After the surveillance feed cut out, the live video from the meeting room had also gone dark. Porter had quickly established a direct line with Cross, offering encouragement and intelligence updates. Initially, Cross had managed to respond with brief updates on her situation, but as the tension mounted, her nerves stretched thin. She focused solely on reaching the hangar, leaving Porter's voice as the only one filling the airwaves. Their legs grew weaker with each step, though it was unclear whether it was due to exhaustion or fear. Fortunately, despite the nerve-wracking journey, the swarm had yet to appear. At last, the group reached the top-level hangar. Most of the base's personnel had been dispatched to support other areas, using transport ships to leave. Only 3 transport ships and 2 gunboats remained in the hangar. With just 5 ships, evacuating several hundred people was an impossible dream. The issue Cross had worried about earlier now presented itself as a grim reality. No matter how she allocated the ships, some people would have to be left behind. Kaida stepped forward, taking on the role of the bad guy. Anyone who can pilot a ship, get on board. The rest of you, find weapons and prepare to defend. Reinforcements will arrive in 10 minutes. With any luck, we won't even have to face the swarm. His words seemed to calm the group, dispelling their selfish thoughts. They began searching the nearby equipment rooms for weapons and breathing masks. The power outage had rendered the electronic locks on the equipment rooms useless, granting the group access to additional supplies. Armed, their courage grew slightly. Cross even felt a moment of inspiration. Perhaps this was her chance to shine. She could lead the defense and hold off the swarm for a few minutes. A successful defense would make her record stand out. Just as she was about to deliver a motivational speech, a sealed hatch dozens of meters away began to corrode, a large hole slowly forming in its surface. Moments later, several raiders emerged. This was Cross's first close encounter with the swarm. Previously, she had only seen video footage and hadn't found the raiders particularly terrifying, even noting a certain feral elegance to them. At just a few dozen centimeters tall, raiders seemed unimposing compared to the 2-meter-tall Riken. Those who had never encountered the swarm often couldn't fathom the terror these small creatures could inspire. Now, with their razor-sharp forelimbs and silent emergence from the hole, the raiders exuded an oppressive menace that left the Riken trembling. "Get the lieutenant colonel to safety!" Kaida barked at his team. His patrol unit, though captured, had mostly survived, retaining much of its cohesion. Two of his subordinates instinctively obeyed, escorting Cross toward the nearest gunboat. Cross didn't resist, following their lead, with her adjutant quickly joining them. As they moved, the others' courage faltered. A few Riken broke into hysterical cries and rushed toward the ships. Their panic spread, causing even more people to flee. The hastily formed defensive line crumbled before any confrontation with the swarm. Fortunately, the wounded soldiers displayed professionalism. Instead of retreating, they raised their weapons and aimed at the hatch. "Shoot! Pin them down! Don't let too many get through!" Kaida shouted. Crimson energy beams filled the air, striking down several raiders as they emerged, reducing them to charred husks. Chapter 252, The Escape. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Colonel Cross and her adjutant, escorted by 2 patrol officers, hurried to a nearby gunboat. Just as she was about to climb aboard, she heard cries from behind her. It turned out that the ships were equipped with an access control system. Normally, these could be unlocked remotely via the base network, but with the energy system disabled, the administrative and medical staff lacked the required permissions to open the hatches. Cross paused, withdrawing her foot from the ship's steps. After a moment of deliberation, she gritted her teeth and turned to run toward the other ships, ignoring her adjutant's calls to stop. As the highest-ranking officer at the base, Cross had the authority to override all systems, but she needed to be physically close to the ships to do so. Fortunately, the ships were not too far apart, and the swarm was pinned down at the hatch by the intense firepower of the wounded patrol team. They had switched their weapons to explosive energy mode, which caused unstable energy beams to detonate on impact. This mode, while less effective at penetrating the hatch, created a barrage that kept the swarm at bay. The hatch held firm under the chaotic red energy blasts, buying Cross precious time to unlock the other ships. Even so, the hole in the hatch was visibly expanding. Cross had to move faster. Luckily, despite her status as a connected officer, she had genuine talent and was a graduate of an elite command academy. Her physical conditioning was impeccable. Within 2 minutes, both the transport ships and gunboats began to lift off, and Cross returned to her original gunboat. Though she initially intended to board any available ship, she changed her mind after seeing the pilots. Even if they were all novices, trained soldiers were undoubtedly more reliable than amateur enthusiasts. The ships were overcrowded. When Cross finally reached the gunboat, it was already packed with people. She managed to squeeze into the cockpit just as the ship began to take off. "Have the exoskeleton team open the dome. Everyone, put on your breathing masks," Kaida shouted, noticing that Cross had safely boarded her gunboat. Despite other officers present, no one challenged Kaida's authority. The exoskeleton-equipped team, along with several other personnel, rushed to a hidden panel on the wall, exposing a hydraulic mechanism. The mechanism, clearly not designed for frequent use, resisted even the combined strength of 3 exoskeleton suits. Slowly but steadily, the steel dome above the hangar began to split open. Impatience proved costly. One transport ship attempted to fly out prematurely, scraping against the dome and losing control. It wobbled erratically before crashing into a wall on the western side of the hangar and falling to the ground. Fortunately, the ship's altitude had been low, and Riken ships were built tough. The impact didn't cause significant damage to the vessel, but the pilot was likely incapacitated, as the ship remained grounded. This mishap sobered the other pilots, who waited for the dome to fully open. Once the gap was wide enough, the remaining ships surged upward. Unbeknownst to them, the swarm had already surrounded the base, taking advantage of their ability to climb and cling to surfaces. The bugs had also stationed acid-spewing insects at the exits. As soon as the ships emerged, they were greeted by a barrage of acidic spray. This acid was highly effective against the ship's metallic exteriors. Within moments, the hulls were riddled with pitted holes that continued to expand as the acid corroded the material. However, the acid wasn't meant to breach the entire hull but to target critical components, specifically, the engines. The energy exhaust ports on the ship's undersides and tails were particularly vulnerable. Although some of the acid vaporized in the exhaust's heat, the engines weren't operating at full power yet, allowing enough acid to reach and damage them. Soon, the engines began to fail, with some even exploding. One by one, the ships were crippled, trailing smoke and plummeting to the ground. The grassy plains surrounding the base were teeming with hidden swarm forces, and the fates of the downed ship's occupants were grim. Cross's gunboat fared slightly better due to its enhanced defensive features and more experienced crew. Though it lost 3 of its 4 engines, the remaining one managed to keep the ship airborne. The pilots, fully aware of their peril, struggled to gain altitude and distance from the battlefield. Amid screams from the passengers, they maneuvered the ship over 10 kilometers before it crashed to the ground. The violent impact left Cross dazed. She vaguely heard the cockpit door being opened. It must have been the pilot, she thought. With the engines damaged and the crash, the gunboat could explode at any moment. She needed to get out. I can't die here, she told herself. Her family, her sister, and her elders were waiting for her return. Clinging to this thought, Cross forced her muddled mind to focus. Though her vision was blurred, she used her memory to feel her way out of the cockpit. At the pilot's seat, where she had heard movement earlier from the patrolman, she found her way forward. But as she crawled, her right hand slipped, and her head struck the edge of the console hard. Her face pressed painfully against her breathing mask, tears and mucus streaming as her nose was crushed. She ignored the discomfort, using her arms to pull herself out of the cockpit and onto the soft grass outside. She rested briefly, intending to crawl further away. Just then, she felt someone pushing her from behind. Too weak to resist, she allowed herself to be turned over. Strong hands lifted her into a seated position, then slid under her arms to lock around her chest, dragging her away from the wreckage. It must be the pilot returning to rescue me, she thought. Good job, I'll make sure to reward you once we're safe. With this comforting realization, Cross's strained nerves finally gave out. She passed out as the tension drained from her body. Chapter 253, The Encounter. Cross awoke from unconsciousness, her head still foggy, likely from a concussion caused by the crash. She struggled to sit up, shaking her head to clear it, and looked around. Where am I? She muttered. The sight before her was startling, a room surrounded by walls of rock and soil, interwoven with dark purple, pulsating growths that seemed to ripple faintly. She assumed they might be plants, though they were unnervingly grotesque. Soft, dim lights flickered, mimicking a rhythmic breathing pattern. The eerie illumination cast shifting shadows that added to the room's unsettling atmosphere. Cross tilted her head to examine the ceiling. Were the lights malfunctioning due to a power shortage? The motion tugged painfully at her injuries, eliciting a groan. Thankfully, her wounds didn't seem as severe as she'd feared, and the pain was bearable. Upon closer inspection, the ceiling wasn't lit by conventional lights but appeared to be lined with luminous stones covering its entirety. Squinting, she peered more closely at the ceiling. Ah! A scream tore from her throat. What she'd assumed to be glowing stones were, in fact, swarms of fingernail-sized bugs clinging to the ceiling. Their abdomens contained glowing organs, which they lit and dimmed in unison, creating the illusion of a single breathing light source. Is anyone there? She called out, her voice quivering. The sight above was a nightmare for anyone with a fear of swarming creatures. Her skin crawled as if tiny bugs were already all over her, her body racked with cold shivers. Being alone in this creepy room made it all the more terrifying. That cursed patrolman, was this his idea of saving her? And he wanted a promotion for this? Her voice echoed in the enclosed space, but no reply came. She scanned the room more thoroughly, only to discover it had no visible doors. A chill ran up her spine. Summoning all her strength, she shouted again. Suddenly, one of the grotesque purple plants wriggled, splitting open to form a doorway. You're awake, Cross, a voice said in Riken. In this strange, terrifying place, the familiar language brought a slight sense of relief. A tall, male Riken stepped through the newly formed doorway. He was dressed in an antiquated uniform, a design so old that it had been out of commission before Cross was even born. If she hadn't been a top student in her command academy, well versed in history and ship design, she wouldn't have recognized the outdated style. Even back on the Riken home world, uniforms like this were museum pieces. 5 light-years away in another star system? Unthinkable. With strict limits on personal luggage for expeditions, who would waste space on something so impractical? Cross's usual sarcastic thoughts almost escaped her lips, but she restrained herself, knowing the current situation demanded caution. Forcing a soft tone, she asked, "Who are you? And where am I?" She didn't really care about the first question, who this nobody was, mattered little. But since he knew her name, it was only polite to ask. The man didn't answer immediately, instead walking closer. As he approached, she could see him more clearly. He was a middle-aged Riken with a strong, determined face that seemed oddly familiar. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall meeting him before. His uniform, however, triggered recognition as he drew nearer. The shoulder epaulets, sleeve insignias, and chest badges, they looked increasingly familiar. Then it hit her. Of course, they were familiar. This was the same style worn by the captain who had led the first interstellar expedition, the one posthumously honored as a hero. His life story was famous, used to justify the creation of the expedition fleet. Her cadet manual even had a section dedicated to his uniform. Cross stared at the man, heart pounding as a realization began to take hold. That face, that uniform, this was... You're Captain Reggie, she stammered, horrified. Her voice trembled as she whispered to herself, "Am I dead? But I remember being dragged away." Frantically, she pinched herself hard. "Ow!" she yelped, the pain affirming the reality of her situation. Her overzealous pinch exacerbated her injuries, making her wince further. "I'm alive. This isn't a dream. I even have a shadow," she muttered, spiraling into incoherent rambling. The stress was clearly taking its toll on her. Finally, she asked, her voice tinged with hysteria, "Captain Reggie? You're alive? How is that possible?" Reggie chuckled darkly. "Yes, it's been over a century. 100 years since I left Riken. Missing for decades, how could I possibly still be alive?" Cross's fear spiked once again. "Am I dead? Is that why I'm seeing you?" she blurted out, panic creeping back into her voice. "No, you're not dead. Has the new generation of Riken commanders fallen so far? I heard you're supposed to be a lieutenant colonel." Reggie's mocking tone didn't faze Cross. Relieved to hear she wasn't dead, she exhaled shakily. Her mind flooded with more questions. "Captain, so you're alive? But wasn't the Cat's Ear spaceship attacked in T-855? Why are you here in T-853? How have you survived all these years? Are there other survivors? Everyone will be so thrilled to know you're alive." She fired off her questions without pause, prompting Reggie to smirk in amusement. "Didn't I just say? Reggie isn't alive," he replied cryptically. "What? Captain, now isn't the time for jokes." Cross snapped, frustration boiling over. Her injuries, the bizarre setting, and his evasive answers tested her patience. "I'm not joking. Reggie is dead," he said solemnly, his steadfast expression lending weight to his words. "Then who are you?" Cross demanded, her unease returning. "I am Reggie," he answered. Cross's frustration reached a peak. If not for her injuries, she would have demonstrated some of the advanced combat techniques she'd mastered. "Captain, teasing a junior officer isn't exactly noble," she said bitterly. "No, I mean the Reggie you knew is dead. I am the reborn Reggie," he clarified. The explanation left Cross reeling. Clones? Robots? Alien experiments? Scenes from countless sci-fi dramas flashed through her mind. Had he been captured and brainwashed by aliens? And if so, would she meet the same fate? Her thoughts returned to the base's assault. Was this all part of a larger scheme? The horrifying possibility that other captured patrol members might be like Reggie began to take shape. Had the swarm been toying with them all along? The realization widened her eyes in terror. Reggie noted her expression and smiled faintly. "It seems you're catching on. That's good." His grandfatherly smile on his blue face was both reassuring and unnerving. Cross bit back a curse. Provoking him would only worsen her predicament. Resigned, she clenched her fists and declared, I won't betray my people like you have. Reggie clapped slowly, mock admiration in his expression. Good. That's the spirit of a lieutenant colonel. Then, with unnerving certainty, he added, but you will. Once you meet him, you'll understand his greatness. Chapter 254, Memories. Until you meet him, you can never comprehend his greatness. Reggie's words, spoken with deep emotion, drew him into a moment of reflection. Years ago, after he had ordered his crew to cease resistance and open all hatches on the Cat's Ear spaceship, the flying soft-bodied organisms swarmed onto the bridge, encircling them. Thankfully, the creatures did nothing beyond forming a perimeter, making no hostile moves. Reggie's decision had involved a gamble. Until that moment, all they had were hypotheses. If their assumptions were wrong, if these beings were merely clever animals lacking true intelligence, then his decision to disarm and open the ship was tantamount to suicide. Fortunately, his gamble paid off. What are they doing? Lute, the ship's chief scientific advisor, whispered beside him. No idea, Reggie replied, shaking his head. The creatures had surrounded them without attacking or attempting to communicate, leaving the situation in an awkward stalemate. We can't just stand here like fools. Do something. Lute urged. Reggie wanted to retort that they were at the mercy of the creatures, but as the captain of the Cat's Ear and the highest-ranking officer of the expedition, he had to take charge. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward and began to speak, adopting a formal tone. Greetings. We are the Recon, hailing from the Recon star system. Our people are peace-loving and strong, and we come here in friendship. We apologize for intruding and seek to engage in meaningful dialogue. We had no prior knowledge of this territory being occupied. We hope for mutual understanding and exchange. He went on at length, expressing contrition for the perceived trespass while subtly asserting their own strength and hinting that their people wouldn't tolerate mistreatment. The creatures, however, offered no reaction. Undeterred, Reggie repeated his speech, incorporating Recon idioms and colloquialisms in an attempt to bridge the gap. As a multilingual Recon elite, he prided himself on his linguistic skills, but these efforts proved futile. It seemed the languages of Recon held no place in the galaxy's wider tapestry. Parched and frustrated, Reggie retreated and muttered to Lute, "It's no use. We can't communicate verbally. Can you figure out a way to engage biologically?" Lute studied the creature's forms, then glanced at his own. The vastly different anatomies made even gestures and body language challenging. Unexpectedly, Major Camis, the Cat's Ear's highest-ranking military officer, spoke up. "Stop wasting your breath. They're waiting for someone." His words stunned the group. At first, the creature's behavior had baffled him as well, but when he considered it from another perspective, everything clicked. This was a scene straight out of a prisoner of war scenario, low-ranking soldiers apprehending captives and waiting for their superior to arrive. Once Camis pointed it out, Reggie and Lute quickly saw the logic in his observation. Of course. These beings lacked the authority or capability to initiate dialogue. They were likely awaiting a higher-ranking entity. Realizing this, the group abandoned any hope of communicating with the creatures and settled into uneasy silence. Time passed slowly. The oppressive atmosphere felt like a death sentence looming over them, and the Recon crew struggled to maintain composure as fear gnawed at their resolve. Suddenly, the soft-bodied creatures floating around them parted, creating a clear path. "They're here," the Recon crew thought collectively, steeling themselves for the arrival of their captor's leader. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Footsteps? Reggie glanced at the floating creatures in confusion. How could there be footsteps? What was going on? He turned to Lute, who mirrored his bafflement. They exchanged uneasy glances, their mutual understanding unspoken yet clear. Before they could discuss further, the newcomers appeared. A group of 5 humanoid figures emerged, surrounded by the soft-bodied creatures. At the forefront was a female, her presence commanding attention. Standing roughly 1.7 meters tall, her body was covered in fine, purplish-red scales, with intricately designed keratinous armor at her joints. The armor seemed functional yet elegant, suggesting significant defensive capability. Is this their version of a spacesuit? Reggie mused silently, intrigued by its design. Behind the lead female were 4 others, 1 female and 3 males. The secondary female bore a similar appearance, while the males were bulkier and more rugged. Their scales were darker, almost black, and noticeably larger. Their keratinous armor featured jagged spikes at the joints and shoulders, while sharp horns jutted from their helmets, lending them an intimidating appearance. Savages, was Reggie's first impression. But as they drew closer, he realized something shocking: their armor wasn't armor at all. It was part of their bodies. What kind of creatures are these? Although not a biologist, Reggie knew enough about evolutionary biology to find this puzzling. Intelligent species that relied heavily on tools and technology typically lost such defensive or offensive physical traits over time. Yet these beings, despite their apparent intelligence and advanced technology, retained distinctly primal features. He recalled their earlier speculation that these creatures belonged to a biological civilization. Even so, their appearance defied expectations. Had Sarah Kerrigan overheard his thoughts, she might have found them amusing. The swarm overlord had personally designed this diplomatic attire, insisting it reflect the swarm's terrifying essence. Though Sarah appreciated its aesthetic, she suspected the overlord's penchant for theatrics played a role in the design. Sarah, though new to diplomatic negotiations with alien captives, carried herself with the poise of someone who had ruled a species for decades. Her presence in this form exuded an even greater aura of authority. Reggie immediately recognized her as a seasoned leader. Her graceful movements and commanding demeanor betrayed a lifetime of leadership, the kind that couldn't be faked or cultivated overnight. Even her elegance seemed like music, intangible, yet undeniably distinct. A noble? Perhaps even royalty? Reggie speculated. Concluding she was a significant figure, Reggie adjusted his approach. With humility, he reiterated his earlier speech, hoping to make a positive impression. Unfortunately, the language barrier persisted, and his opening remarks achieved little progress. Tib. Chapter 255, Collapse. Language barriers proved relatively easy to resolve. By finding mutual reference points, both sides quickly managed to translate their conversations. However, the female leader of the aliens clearly lacked patience. After a brief appearance, she departed swiftly, leaving behind a female guard in her place. Later, Reggie learned the guard's name was Tella, who referred to herself as the Empress's chief guard. As suspected, this was royalty. Yet, it seemed odd for their Empress to personally visit. Did she have too much free time? Reggie couldn't make sense of their relationships, but he didn't dare to ask Tella. This alien female was stoic and unapproachable, making communication nearly impossible. Reggie's earlier assumption proved correct: the Raikon's prison was indeed the Cat's Ear spaceship. His foresight in suggesting surrender earlier had improved the Raikon tribe's quality of life considerably. The aliens didn't restrict their movements. After dismantling a few components from the ship's engine and disabling the AI, they allowed the Raikons free rein within the ship's cabins. The Cat's Ear spaceship had been dragged to the asteroid belt near T855. From the windows, one could clearly see small, nearby asteroids. Over time, numerous alien researchers came aboard. These researchers were much more normal-looking than the intimidating guards. Did the aliens draw such clear distinctions between their scientific and military personnel? Was it that obvious based solely on appearance? Reggie had once observed the guards' armor up close. It was genuinely part of their bodies. Incredible. At least, seeing his old friend Lute utterly dumbfounded made Reggie feel a bit better. The researchers were exceptionally intelligent, quickly learning the Raikon language. During conversations, they asked detailed questions about the Cat's Ear spaceship's various instruments, their functions, and principles. Under Reggie's subtle guidance, the Raikons withheld critical information. The aliens didn't seem to mind. Gradually, Reggie became somewhat friendly with a few alien researchers and learned they referred to themselves as the Swarm. He had no idea what that meant and resorted to a phonetic transcription. Just as the Swarm didn't comprehend the meaning behind Raikon, the Raikon didn't understand Swarm. Reggie continued to extract information. Why didn't they have armor? Who was the female alien that day? Who was their leader? Morgan, why don't you have armor? Because it's unnecessary. Do you mean you could grow it if you wanted? Yes. How? Just eat more. For some reason, Reggie felt Morgan, the alien researcher, was mocking him. Who was the female alien that day? Sarah Kerrigan. What's her role? Commander. Is she your leader? No, she leads the Blades. And you? I am part of the Swarm. Reggie felt he was onto something and quickly probed further. Are you two separate species? An alliance between the Blades and the Swarm. That would explain why they looked different. They weren't even the same species. Morgan shook his head. The Blades are the Swarm, but the Swarm isn't just the Blades. Reggie pondered for a moment before hesitantly asking, "So, the blades are a part of the swarm?" "Correct." Reggie pieced it together in his head. Based on Morgan's explanation, the collective entity was called the Swarm, but it had many factions, one of which was the Blades, led by Kerrigan. That seemed to be the gist of it. This was significant intelligence. He wondered about the dynamics between these groups and whether there were any exploitable opportunities. The aliens seemed blissfully unaware of Riken cunning, sharing information freely. He'd need to discuss this with Lute and Major Camis later. For now, Reggie feigned ignorance and asked, "Does the swarm have a leader?" "Yes." "Who? Can I meet them?" "In time, you might. He calls himself F2A, Morgan replied with a peculiar smile. Reggie was baffled. That name felt entirely out of place compared to the others. Morgan seemed disinclined to continue the topic, instead asking about operating various instruments. Out of politeness, Reggie shared trivial information while guarding the ship's core secrets. These details were his bargaining chips, he wouldn't give them away so easily. Morgan clearly noticed Reggie's guardedness but didn't seem to care. That evening, the three giants of the Cat's Ear spaceship, Reggie, Lute, and Major Camis, held a secret dinner meeting. "I have a bad feeling," Lute began. "What's wrong?" Reggie asked, puzzled. His experience over the past few days had been relatively positive. The aliens were candid, answering almost all questions, and he'd gathered considerable intelligence. "They're too candid. And that's bad because..." Lute grew exasperated. "Did your brain short-circuit? You should have noticed this before me, I'm just a scientific advisor." Reggie's heart sank. His old friend wouldn't say this without cause. Recently, his decision to surrender and preserve the Cat's Ear spaceship had earned him praise from the crew for his foresight. The aliens also treated them courteously. Aside from questions about release or returning to Recon's home planet, the aliens answered everything. This had made him complacent. Lute's words jolted him back to reality. Yes, the aliens' openness might not stem from goodwill but from the belief that the Recons would never leave alive. What good was intelligence if they couldn't escape to deliver it? The realization sent a cold sweat down Reggie's back. Fortunately, it wasn't too late. His overheated brain cooled, and his wits returned. After some thought, he asked Lute, "Do we have a chance to escape? They haven't restricted us. Can we secretly repair the ship?" "Escape? Where would we go?" "Impossible," Lute said. "They dismantled the engine beyond repair. Even if we somehow fixed it, the solar sail is destroyed. Without it, the ship's speed would take us over 1,000 years to reach home, even without factoring in energy reserves or the chance of structural failure." Lute was near collapse. "If escape is impossible, stop thinking about it," Major Camis interjected with surprising nonchalance. "Eat well, sleep well, at worst, we die." The three fell silent. Their meeting ended with a grim mood. Reggie, now depressed, didn't even feel like sharing his hypothesis about the swarm's internal factions. Chapter 256, Anticipation. 2 weeks passed, and the swarm's researchers learned at an astonishing pace. Reggie surmised that while the swarm appeared to be a biological civilization on the surface, they possessed a surprisingly solid foundation in mechanical theory. The questions they posed to the Ricans became fewer, and Reggie noticed that the swarm managed to deduce much of the information and technology he had considered his bargaining chips in a very short time. Reggie understood that the researchers on the ship were merely the tip of the iceberg. Behind them lay an even larger team, likely numbering in the thousands or even tens of thousands. This was a truly formidable civilization. He felt foolish for initially dismissing them as primitive beasts. Looking back, his naivety was laughable. As their bargaining chips dwindled, so did their value. No one would expend resources on maintaining something worthless. Many among the Riken crew realized this, and unease began to spread. Their fears weren't unwarranted. A month later, 2 Rikens were taken away. Due to the lack of a central gathering place, convenient communication devices, or AI assistants, it took 2 days for the others to notice their absence. These 2 had been members of the guard unit, rarely interacting with the rest, so their disappearance went unnoticed until their captain sought them out. Reggie had no idea where they were taken. When he asked Morgan and the other researchers, they merely smiled enigmatically without answering. Now, those smiles felt entirely different from when he first encountered them. They no longer seemed friendly but rather sinister, even terrifying. Reggie began to feel like a piece of meat on a butcher's block, helpless and at the mercy of others. Gradually, word of the disappearances spread, and fear permeated the ship. Half a month later, 2 more Rikans vanished. Many Rikans were on the verge of collapse upon learning this. Some began cooperating more readily with the swarm researchers, eagerly answering questions or even volunteering information. Others, however, adopted a defiant attitude, utterly unbothered by their predicament. The Rikans quietly split into 2 factions, antagonizing one another and viewing the other with disdain. The disappearances continued, with 2 Rikans vanishing roughly every fortnight, affecting both factions indiscriminately. The swarm appeared to have its own selection criteria, unaltered by their attitudes. "Do you know where they're being taken?" Lute asked. Reggie shook his head. "Aren't you close with that Morgan? Didn't you learn anything useful from him?" Lute pressed, unwilling to relent. "Ha!" Reggie let out a bitter laugh, tinged with self-mockery, resentment, and frustration. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lute, his own emotions unstable, rolled up his sleeves, ready for a fight. "Ha!" Reggie scoffed again, this time with pure derision. As Reggie's longtime friend, Lute recognized the underlying challenge in that laugh. "Come on, if you dare." It seemed Reggie, too, needed to vent. "Enough!" Camis interjected. "From the moment they boarded our ship, we were as good as dead. That we've survived this long is already a bonus. Don't disgrace yourselves in front of the crew now." The 2 men, poised for a brawl, cooled their tempers at Camis's words. Indeed, what would a fight accomplish? Best to maintain their dignity to the end. "You know, I think every day about where those missing people are taken," Lute said, deliberately changing the subject. "The swarm is a biological civilization. Do you know what that means?" "What does it mean?" Reggie asked, playing along to defuse the tension. "It means they're more interested in us than in those mechanical components. After all, alien life forms from another star system might provide more significant insights into their technology." Reggie and Camis were both startled but then felt a sense of grim acceptance. They had considered this possibility before but had chosen to ignore it. Lute's blunt statement now forced them to confront it. Fear, helplessness, and despair surged within them. 6 months later, the swarm had stripped the Cat's Ear spaceship of anything valuable, including its AI storage system. Their researchers gradually left, signaling the completion of their analysis. The ship, now devoid of worth, became a true prison. When the swarm researchers had been present, the atmosphere was one of scientific inquiry, and the crew didn't feel the weight of their captivity as acutely. But as the swarm personnel withdrew, the oppressive reality became undeniable. As time dragged on, Rikans reacted differently. Some shouted and screamed in the cabins, venting their emotions. Others descended into madness, weeping uncontrollably or lapsing into silence. Eventually, all fell into a state of apathy. They waited, each silently anticipating their turn to be taken. And they hoped it would come soon. The waiting was far more excruciating than the unknown fate awaiting them. 2 years later. Reggie was emaciated, the prolonged mental torment having reduced him to a shadow of his former self. Once robust, he now looked inhuman. A year earlier, the swarm had stopped adhering to a consistent schedule for taking Rikans. Sometimes, several would be taken in quick succession, other times, months would pass without a single abduction. The 3 giants speculated that something might have gone wrong with the swarm's research. But what could they do, even if they knew? 6 months ago, Camis was taken. A month later, Lute followed. Reggie was the last of the 3 giants. The once bustling ship now felt desolate, with only a handful of Rikans remaining. Reggie envied those who had been taken. At least they were no longer suffering. Footsteps echoed steady and firm, devoid of any hesitation. On the Cat's Ear spaceship, only a non-Rikan could walk with such confidence. The sound was like a heavenly melody. A figure appeared before Reggie, who sat slumped against the wall. Slowly, he raised his head. "Is it finally my turn?" he rasped, his voice unrecognizable from its former vigor. "Impatient, old friend," came the reply, laced with a smile. The speaker used perfect Rikan language, their voice betraying nothing of their alien origins. "Ah," Reggie sighed deeply, a sound tinged with a mix of longing, reluctance, resentment, and relief, with a faint hint of joy. "Let's go," Morgan said softly. Morgan helped Reggie into a protective suit. Together, they walked out of the cabin, flanked by 2 guards clad in fearsome bio-armor. A mature bio-ship awaited at the exit. Reggie, seeing it for the first time, realized it could transport people. Reflecting on his time aboard the Cat's Ear spaceship, he felt his earlier intelligence gathering barely scratched the surface. Smiling wryly, he asked, "Is it alive?" Morgan paused, then smiled. "Of course. Not only is it alive, but it will also continue to grow." As he spoke, he stepped ahead and stroked the ship, which responded with a slight tremor. Reggie's eyes widened. "You mean, the ones that attacked us earlier?" "Yes, those were larval bodies. This is what they grow into, and they'll get even bigger." Reggie had initially thought the bio-ships resembled the soft-bodied creatures that had attacked them, assuming they were merely different models. Like the differences between small and large aircraft in mechanical technology, their principles were similar, so their designs appeared related. He hadn't imagined they were the same organisms. Was this what it meant to be a biological civilization? Incredible technology, Reggie muttered, his thoughts turning to his people. Could the Riken race truly contend with such a civilization? Their potential for war didn't even seem comparable. Inside the bio-ship, the interior was surprisingly comfortable. Yet, there were no windows or visible interfaces. How did the aliens perceive the outside world? Did the ship act autonomously? It was utterly baffling. Chapter 257, Experiment. Soon, they landed on a planet. As Reggie stepped out of the cabin, he glanced around. In the distance, the familiar sight of T-855 appeared as a half-visible sphere. This indicated that the current location must be one of T-855's planets. However, due to the angle, he couldn't determine which one. The ground quivered, revealing a deep, dark entrance as Morgan led the way inside. Once inside, Reggie realized that while the planet's surface seemed unremarkable, it was merely a thin outer layer. Beneath a layer of sand and rocks, the area had been hollowed out by a dark purple biological material. These structures resembled internal organs, occasionally writhing. As they passed, a faint purple glow illuminated their path. Amazing, Reggie marveled. No wonder they hadn't detected this before. It was extraordinarily well hidden. If you'd seen the neon-lit KTV-style ambience from earlier, you'd find it even more incredible, Morgan thought but refrained from saying aloud. He wasn't sure if the Overlord was watching, and such embarrassing history was strictly taboo in the Overlord's presence. "How do you plan to execute me?" Reggie finally asked, unable to suppress his curiosity as Morgan continued leading him through the winding passageways. He had come to terms with his fate, understanding Camis's mindset from before. Morgan paused briefly before responding with a faint smile. "Old friend, it's not what you think. You're going to experiment on me, aren't you?" This was Reggie's greatest fear. He'd already glimpsed a fraction of the swarm's methods. "No," Morgan replied firmly. "Then surely you're not letting me go?" Reggie asked skeptically, though he couldn't help but feel a sliver of hope. "You never know," Morgan said with a grin. "Are you serious? You're not going to kill me?" Reggie was dubious, yet a spark of anticipation lit within him. "Well, we'll kill you but you'll be reborn." Fear gripped Reggie as those words carried an ominous undertone, filling him with dread. Noticing Reggie's reaction, Morgan tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, you'll like it." "How would you know what I'd like?" Reggie cursed inwardly. But it was too late to change anything now, he could only wait and face his fate. Finally, they reached a small room composed entirely of the dark purple biological material. Under Morgan's direction, Reggie lay in the center as the material began to writhe, slowly encasing him. Before he was completely enveloped, he vaguely heard Morgan's voice, "Old friend, haven't you always wanted to meet him? When you wake up, you'll finally get the chance." "Who is he?" Reggie's muffled shout emerged from the undulating cocoon. Darkness consumed his consciousness. Morgan stared at the pulsating spore capsule before him. Over the years, while he always referred to Luo Wen as Overlord in front of others, he preferred calling Luo Wen God in private. It had been over a century since the first intelligent entity, Morgan, had been created. Since then, millions of rat folk had undergone conversion, and Luo Wen's understanding of the process had deepened. Through his observations and experiments, Luo Wen discovered that when a rat folk's spirit entered the swarm network, it underwent a complex transformation far beyond simply passing through a door. First, the spirit's memories were stripped away by the swarm network. Then, the spirit itself was used as raw material to create an intelligent entity. The swarm network absorbed the spirit's energy and molded it into a prototype entity. Initially, the newly created entity was a blank slate, devoid of consciousness or memory. At this stage, the entity had no connection to its original spirit, akin to how consumed food is digested and transformed into fat. The entity was now entirely a product of the swarm, no different from the biological units produced by the brood nests of physical creation of the swarm. However, an entity without consciousness had limited utility. Thus, the swarm network would replicate the stripped memories and inject them into the entity, endowing it with intellect and creativity. This process ensured their unwavering loyalty to Luo Wen. Luo Wen functioned as both the server and the database itself, while these entities were akin to NPCs derived from the player's data. Fundamentally, they were extensions of Luo Wen. Once this concept was clarified, Luo Wen's research could progress further. Why could rat folk be converted into intelligent entities? The rat folk were experimental creations of Luo Wen. Their ancestors carried genetic material from the brood nests, some were even direct brood creations. While this alone wasn't sufficient for them to become entities, it provided a foundation. Using a farming analogy, the entities were the fruit. To harvest fruit, one first needed fertile soil. The bodies infused with swarm genes served as this fertile soil. With the soil prepared, the next requirement was a seed. This seed could be likened to a soul or spirit, which would grow and develop in the fertile soil until it reached a harvestable state. However, Luo Wen discovered that not all seeds were viable. Most fell short of the standard. He had experimented with numerous animals, but their spirits failed to meet the minimum requirements for creating entities. Luo Wen realized that seeds also required nutrients. This nutrient consisted of knowledge, experience, and what could collectively be termed wisdom. Though unscientific, it was a proven fact. The rat folk's ancestors couldn't become entities due to a lack of wisdom. Over generations, as they developed civilizations, their progress cultivated wisdom, which, in turn, nourished the seeds. Eventually, with soil, seeds, and nutrients all meeting the standards, suitable material was produced, harvested by the swarm network, and transformed into entities. Until now, only rat folk had achieved the required criteria among Luo Wen's creations. Other species failed to meet one or more elements of the triad. The primary obstacle for other species was nutrients wisdom. Cultivating an intelligent species was immensely challenging, requiring an ecological planet and vast amounts of time. Luo Wen lacked the patience to nurture another civilization as he had with the rat folk. Fortunately, there was no urgent need for this. In essence, such civilizations functioned as material production bases. Though the rat folk's base alone sufficed for the swarm's current needs, having additional bases would be beneficial. If Genesis Planet were ever destroyed, the inability to produce entities would be a catastrophic loss. Fortunately, the appearance of the Riken offered a new opportunity. Chapter 258, The Three Elements. As Lute had suspected, the technology aboard the Cat's Ear spaceship was, compared to its intrinsic value, no more than scrap metal for the swarm. The experiments commenced swiftly. Luo Wen, with his extensive experience from countless tests conducted during the genesis of intelligent entities, approached this process with confidence. The creation of intelligent entities relies on three essential elements: soil, seeds, and nutrients. First comes the nutrients, intricately tied to the seeds in a symbiotic relationship. The Riken civilization has a far more ancient history than the rat folk, making the latter appear as a newly emergent culture in comparison. From this perspective, wisdom nourished by such a venerable civilization was bound to meet the required standards. And seeds cultivated by such wisdom would likely be exceptional as well. So far, the highest quality seed Luo Wen had encountered was the first-generation rat folk empress, Sarah. Her spiritual essence was extraordinarily refined, and her capacity for reception exceeded all others. Most intelligent entities would enter a comatose state after the infusion of memories due to an adaptation process, but Sarah showed no such reaction. Although this was the only advantage Luo Wen had discovered in her, he was certain there was more to uncover as his capabilities and familiarity with her deepened. However, Sarah was merely an exception. From the perspective of nutrients, the Riken civilization, with its profound cultural heritage, might produce entities of higher average quality compared to the rat folk. While there were no issues with seeds and nutrients, the Riken people encountered a bottleneck in the most fundamental element, the soil. Their bodies lacked any connection to the swarm. Yet, this issue was relatively straightforward to address given the swarm's current capabilities. Luo Wen's proudest creation wasn't the rat folk, nor the hive queens, but the fungal carpet. The fungal carpet, a genetic amalgamation, possessed unparalleled versatility and compatibility. Electromagnetic cannons, bioships, and external incubation chambers were just a few of its derivatives. Nearly every unit in the swarm now had some degree of association with it. By implanting fungal carpet cells into the bodies of the Reikan people, their physical forms could gradually be transformed into suitable soil. Luo Wen had conducted similar experiments on various wild animals in the past, all of which succeeded. Unfortunately, these subjects ultimately failed in the seed and nutrient stages, preventing their transformation into intelligent entity production materials. The transformation process was remarkably smooth. After only a few failures and the loss of a handful of test subjects, the soil was gradually modified. Seeds then thrived in the enriched nutrients. A year later, the seeds matured and were harvested. Thus, the first Reikan intelligent entity was born. Subsequently, Reikan intelligent entities began to appear at a rate of 2 every half month, precisely matching the frequency with which crew members were taken, as recalled by Reggie. Despite the success, Luo Wen still perceived minor flaws in the process. First, during the transformation of soil, the fungal carpet cells within their bodies could be detected. Given the Reikan people's advanced technology, such anomalies would be easy for them to discover. This made covertly transforming the Reikan into hosts unsuitable. However, once the transformation was complete and the seed converted into an intelligent entity, the swarm could use the original body as a template to produce an identical new one. This new body could be made indistinguishable from its pre-transformation state, leaving no detectable differences. This sparked some plans in Luo Wen's mind at the time. These plans, however, led to a second minor flaw. The transformation of the soil took too long. Allowing the fungal carpet cells to slowly alter the entire body of a Reikan individual required almost a year. This extended time frame rendered Luo Wen's plans nearly unfeasible. Thus, accelerating the maturation of seeds became Luo Wen's next research focus. The remaining Reikan test subjects became precious, a non-renewable resource in the short term. Even if Luo Wen attempted to breed them in captivity, the seeds produced without the proper nutrient environment would likely differ from the originals. Furthermore, the experimentation itself introduced risks to the otherwise perfected technique. Under such circumstances, the timeline for converting key Reikan figures into intelligent entities was postponed. If, in the end, the ordinary Reikan subjects were exhausted before the maturation acceleration experiments reached the desired results, the important figures would have to be used. While they still possessed some classified information, its value had likely already diminished due to time, rendering it insufficient to save them from becoming expendable resources. Fortunately, the experiments progressed well. Luo Wen's centuries of accumulated expertise finally bore fruit. The maturation period for the seeds was compressed to 7 days. At this point, further reductions became nearly impossible. On both genetic and spiritual levels, Luo Wen had reached the current limits of his ability. Within these 7 days, half a day was allocated to the fungal carpetification of the body. During the remaining 6.5 days, the body's transformation facilitated a profound metamorphosis of the spiritual essence, culminating in its connection to the swarm network. Further compressing this metamorphosis period would severely damage the spiritual essence, rendering it incapable of retaining memories. Such a compromised entity would be utterly useless to Luo Wen. Thankfully, 7 days, while inconvenient, held strategic value. The reduced time frame came with one unavoidable side effect: irreversible destruction of the physical body. For the swarm, creating a new body for an intelligent entity was effortless. However, applying this research to practical plans still required careful consideration. Reggie awoke fully aware of everything. Before regaining his body, the Hive Queen had transmitted essential information to him. He inherited all of Reggie's past and continued to exist as Swarm Reggie. "Old friend, how do you feel?" Morgan asked as Reggie sat up. "Excellent. Better than ever," Reggie said, flexing his arm. "But why put me in the same body as before? I need something more robust." "I thought you might feel nostalgic," Morgan replied with a grin. "I've been reborn. I should leave the old era behind," Reggie said firmly. Different seeds produced subtly distinct outcomes. Perhaps because the rat folk were derivatives of the brood nest's creations, intelligent entities made from them, while absolutely loyal to Luo Wen, often experienced identity confusion for the first few years post-conversion, craving a return to their former lives. Reikan intelligent entities, however, exhibited no such tendencies. From the moment they awoke post-conversion, they clearly understood their identities, leaving no room for confusion. Luo Wen marveled at this difference and welcomed it wholeheartedly. Chapter 259, The Plan. So, is there anything else you've been hiding? Morgan asked. Reggie, still adjusting to his newly implanted memories, furrowed his brow and pondered for a while before replying, I did withhold some information, but I'm unclear about the most critical details. Morgan nodded knowingly. As expected. Fortunately, we still have plenty of time. When the enemy comes, we'll meet them head-on. Even if the Reckon people have backing, the swarm is not to be trifled with. When the time comes, we may need your body to help your former kin understand the greatness of our overlord. Ha, they should consider it an honor, Reggie replied with a smirk. Reggie then integrated into the blade system. As a former elite of the Reckon people, with a systematic education, he and Major Camis, who had arrived earlier, brought new insights to the blades. The clash of knowledge from two civilizations was bound to spark brilliant results. The arrival of the Reckon fleet was faster and far larger in scale than the swarm had anticipated. This revealed that their external support was much greater than initially estimated, forcing the swarm to remain hidden until they understood the reason behind this assistance. Still, the swarm had its own advantages. Luo Wen's original form was an extraordinary being from another world. He had carved a unique path in this universe, granting him unparalleled abilities and a bizarre life form. Another advantage of the swarm was the concealment of its true capabilities. The Reckon, following their technological and cultural paradigms, underestimated the indigenous civilizations in the neighboring star system due to the lack of large-scale artificial constructs or scientific activity in space. The swarm exploited this arrogance to execute a series of plans. First, they ambushed a detachment of Reckon soldiers. Although some unexpected developments led to the plan being discovered slightly ahead of schedule, the timeline shifted only minimally, causing no significant impact on the swarm's overall strategy. The captured soldiers were transformed into intelligent entities over the next 7 days. Identical bodies were prepared during this period to replace their originals. These newly converted Reckon soldiers provided some intelligence, but none explained the sudden technological leaps of their civilization. Even if such information had surfaced, its reliability would have been questionable, likely known only to a select few among the fleet's captains. Thankfully, the swarm had never pinned its hopes on such an easy acquisition of knowledge. Instead, they unearthed another crucial piece of information: the Reckon expedition fleet was rife with factions, a fact well known even to ordinary soldiers. The initial fortresses and bases established on the ground were controlled by the fleet's elite. Each base's highest commander was likely to be a fleet captain, and these individuals were most likely privy to the real reason behind the Reckon's technological advancements. This aligned with the swarm's prior assumptions, setting the stage for the next phase of the plan. During the 7-day transformation process, the swarm kept the Reckon occupied without revealing anything extraordinary. The Blades predicted that the Reckon would opt for a cautious approach to explore the mysterious species they had encountered. Far from their home world, with limited resources, they were unlikely to squander manpower and materials on a seemingly primitive species. To them, the swarm was merely a nuisance impeding the terraforming of T-853, while the T-855 civilization, capable of space-based attacks on the Cat's Ear spaceship, posed a greater threat. As predicted, the Reckon decided to uncover a way to counter the swarm by excavating underground nests. Upon realizing this, the swarm launched regular hunting operations, sacrificing countless expendable bugs to feign low intelligence and harmlessness. The swarm's flawless performance allowed the 7 days to pass swiftly. Once the transformation of the intelligent entities was complete, the challenge became reintegrating them seamlessly into the Reckon forces. To achieve this, the swarm retrofitted large underground caverns near each ambushed base into grain storage facilities, carefully aged to appear authentic. The attention to detail ensured the deception's success. Yet, the Reckon's methodical digging progress lagged behind the script. At their pace, it would take several more days to reach the grain stores. As each day passed, the number of prisoners in the grain storehouses needed to diminish logically. Otherwise, their prolonged survival would raise suspicion. Attention to detail was paramount. Against a civilization, even minor flaws could lead to catastrophic failure. The swarm could not allow such mistakes. With the Reckon's sluggish progress, the swarm staged a desperate counterattack, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of bugs to mislead the Reckon into believing they had uncovered the cause of the bug retaliation. This ultimately led the Reckon to discover the remaining operatives. The operatives' original bodies had long since been consumed by the fungal carpet transformation. Their new bodies, meticulously crafted by the brood nest from their genetic templates, were indistinguishable from the originals. No Recon inspection could detect any anomalies. Thus, the operatives successfully infiltrated the bases. With operatives in place, the next phase of the plan could proceed smoothly. Thanks to the prior attacks on base patrols, the swarm had already gathered substantial intelligence on the base's layouts. One infiltrated base, known as Cross Base, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Cross, the youngest captain in the Recon expedition fleet. Holding authority over one of the few dozen ground bases indicated her significant status. For the swarm, she was a prime target. Capturing her even without obtaining key information would allow her conversion into an intelligent entity, enabling deep infiltration of the Recon leadership and benefiting future swarm operations. However, Cross was protected by a heavily fortified base, with ships ready to evacuate her at any moment. The swarm had yet to reveal its aerial units, and even if it did, the physical limitations of wild organisms made it difficult to pose a threat to Recon airships. Thus, capturing Cross within reasonable constraints was a daunting challenge. Chapter 260, A Reasonable Coincidence. Capturing Lieutenant Colonel Cross was only part of the mission. Once the conversion was complete, the swarm would need to return her undetected. Thus, to ensure the success of subsequent plans, the swarm's displayed abilities during the capture operation had to remain within the bounds of what the Recon people could plausibly accept. Fortunately, with over 100 operatives already embedded, the swarm overcame this formidable challenge. First, the swarm needed to isolate Cross Base from external reinforcements. This problem had been anticipated when the operatives were initially sent back. By exposing the survival of Recon personnel, the swarm knew that, regardless of the circumstances, the commanders would initiate rescue operations. The swarm's deliberate reduction of patrol team members near the grain storehouses proved to be a meaningful ploy. The Recon people, luckily noticing this trend, were compelled to expedite their operations. The swarm's plan involved luring forces from other bases deep into underground nests while occupying them with drawn-out skirmishes. Meanwhile, a massive swarm would gather to launch a blitz on Cross Base. The plan unfolded surprisingly smoothly. While the Recon demonstrated caution using flamethrowers to clear paths slowly rather than advancing recklessly, most of Cross Base's military strength was dispatched to support other bases. Due to the operatives' low ranks, the swarm only learned of this development shortly before the attack. Initially, the swarm had amassed over 30 million raiders around Cross Base, prepared to deploy them as needed. If the base had been heavily defended, the swarm would have committed large numbers, risking exposure but ensuring success. Such an outcome would have raised alarms within the Recon fleet about the swarm's vast scale. However, the timely intelligence altered the strategy. Adding to this, the unexpected involvement of an operative among the guards shocked Sarah and the Blades, as it revealed just how understaffed Cross Base truly was. Previously, due to the low status and injured condition of the operatives, their movements within the base were limited to avoid suspicion. Consequently, the swarm had little detailed knowledge of the base's internal structure. Now, with an operative embedded among the guards, Cross Base's defensive layout was fully exposed to the swarm. The swarm could bypass minefields, sensors, and automated defensive weapons, reducing the need for large-scale deployments. Although the Recon might question how the swarm avoided their defenses, concluding that the swarm possessed intelligence, this was an acceptable loss. The swarm had already hinted at this capability during previous encounters. Using an already exposed detail to obscure the swarm's true scale was a worthwhile trade-off. Moreover, lacking sufficient context, the Recon could never deduce the true source of the breach. With the operative's assistance, the swarm bypassed defenses and reached the perimeter of the base's main structure. Exposed outposts and hidden sentries stood no chance against the swarm's various observational units, especially with inside help. Still, the operative's role ended here. The swarm would not jeopardize a valuable card by having them open the gates. It would have been foolish to expose such an asset for something so trivial. Thus, the operatives were eliminated at their posts. While their bodies perished, their consciousness returned to the swarm network. As long as Luowen remained, the swarm's intelligent entities were immortal. For the heavily fortified gates, specially designed acid bugs easily dissolved the barriers. These readily produced creatures were expendable tools, and exposing their existence posed no risk. The base's general layout was already known to the swarm thanks to the operatives. The swarm network's capability for secure, real-time communication proved invaluable in wartime, allowing attacking forces to head directly for the command center. The Blades surmised that Cross was most likely there. Even if she wasn't, microscout bugs were already spreading throughout the base. These expendable bugs served as decoys, drawing attention away from the main attack. Simultaneously, the swarm's aggressive assault heightened pressure on the defenders, forcing Cross to expose her position. True to expectations, the swarm soon received word from an operative pinpointing her location. However, this revelation came with a downside: Riken reinforcements would arrive sooner than anticipated. Attempting to capture Cross inside the base and then escape presented two problems. First, time constraints made it likely they would be cornered by the reinforcements. Second, such a direct action would contradict the swarm's image as only semi-intelligent, making it clear the capture was deliberate. Furthermore, it would make Cross's eventual return problematic. A prominent figure intentionally targeted by the swarm, rescued after the fall of an entire base, would undoubtedly raise suspicions. Thus, the situation called for an accident that would compel Cross to leave the base on her own. The swarm intensified its attack, maintaining enough distance to create tension without breaching the base. The pressure led to a reasonable suggestion being relayed to Cross, subtly influencing her decision-making. The suggestion was simple: the base couldn't hold against the swarm, but the bugs couldn't fly. Escaping in an airship would ensure her safety. Because the suggestion was reasonable, it was adopted. Under the cover of heroic sacrifices by patrol unit survivors, Cross boarded a gunship. By this stage, the plan was nearing completion. The Blades, monitoring the situation, breathed a sigh of relief. With both the ground resistance and the gunship's pilot under swarm control, Cross was effectively in their grasp. The swarm escalated its assault. The defensive commander, forced by necessity, ordered the dome open to allow the gunship's escape. Acid bugs lying in wait outside easily damaged the ship with the pilot's cooperation. Billowing black smoke, the gunship made a reasonable emergency landing far from the base. Even if the gunship hadn't been damaged, it would still have landed, and any investigation would attribute the incident to pilot error under duress. After all, a rookie patrolman operating in such high-stress conditions could reasonably make mistakes, right? Wherever the gunship landed, there would coincidentally be a swarm nest nearby. Cross Base's surroundings were riddled with underground passages, ensuring no matter where the gunship landed, a nest was always conveniently close. During the swarm's hunting period, the gunship's occupants being captured was entirely reasonable. Thus, the plan to capture a high-ranking Riken commander concluded perfectly.